The day everything changed at Willow Ridge. The golden light of the late afternoon sun shimmered over the still waters of the pool at Willow Ridge Apartments, a quiet residential complex in Denver, Colorado. Ethan Carter, a 29-year-old financial analyst, stretched out on a poolside lounger, relishing a rare moment of peace after weeks of back-to-back deadlines. With a cold glass of sweet tea in one hand and a worn copy of his favorite novel in the other, he let out a satisfied sigh. This was exactly what he needed, a brief escape from the endless spreadsheets and conference calls. The setting was perfect, the soft rustle of the wind in the nearby oak trees, the distant hum of traffic beyond the gated community, and the rhythmic lapping of the water against the pool's edge. It was one of those moments where everything seemed right. Then, the sound of sharp, deliberate footsteps cut through the tranquility. Ethan looked up and spotted her, a woman in her mid-50s, wearing a perfectly pressed linen blouse, designer sunglasses, and a scowl that seemed permanently etched onto her face. Her silver blonde hair was styled into an immaculate bob, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that suggested she was used to getting her way. He recognized her Meredith Hastings, a longtime resident and self-appointed enforcer of the community's unwritten rules. He had seen her policing minor infractions before, scolding teenagers for playing music too loudly, chastising dog owners for not picking up after their pets. But they had never spoken. Today, it seemed, that was about to change. The woman strode toward him with purpose, her expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. At first, Ethan thought she might need something, maybe directions, or help with something minor, but the look on her face quickly erased any thought of goodwill. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clipped and sharp. "Do you live here?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the abruptness of the question. "Yes, I do," he answered, adjusting his posture as he sat up. The woman tilted her head, eyes narrowing, her skepticism almost palpable. "Really?" she pressed. "Because I've never seen you before. Are you sure you're not visiting someone?" Ethan felt the sting of her assumption, but he forced himself to remain composed. "I'm sure. Apartment 118. I've lived here for 2 years. Her lips pursed, as if the answer somehow didn't sit right with her. "Well, if that's true, then you should have your key fob. Let's see it." Ethan's jaw tightened. The demand was bold, invasive, and completely uncalled for. He took a slow breath, keeping his tone measured. "I don't have to show you anything," he said. "If you have a problem, you're welcome to take it up with management." The woman's face flushed with irritation, her fingers already digging into her designer handbag. "I will. I'm calling security right now," she snapped, pulling out her phone. Ethan let out a slow sigh, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't looking for an argument, but it seemed like he'd been dragged into one anyway. Around the pool, other residents were beginning to take notice. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others subtly reached for their phones, likely recording. The atmosphere shifted. What had been a lazy, peaceful afternoon was now charged with something heavier. Ethan held her gaze, refusing to let her shake him. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the way this was escalating, it was clear that this was about to become much bigger than just a simple misunderstanding. And with the growing attention from bystanders, this wasn't a moment anyone would soon forget. The woman's voice sliced through the quiet air like a blade, her words dripping with self-righteous authority as she spoke into her phone. "Yes, I'm at the pool, and there's someone here who shouldn't be. No, he says he lives here, but I've never seen him before. I need someone to come down immediately." Ethan could feel the weight of every stare. It wasn't just curiosity. People were processing what was happening in real time. Some looked uneasy, shifting in their seats. Others whispered to their companions, their faces caught somewhere between disbelief and discomfort. An older man in swim trunks shook his head slightly, clearly unimpressed with the scene unfolding. But no one spoke up. That silence only fueled her confidence. She turned back to Ethan, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression smug. "You could have avoided all this if you'd just shown me your key fob," she said, as if she had just won a battle. Ethan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I don't owe you anything," he said simply. His calmness seemed to set her off even more. "People like you think you can do whatever you want," she muttered, just loud enough for him and several bystanders to hear. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what she meant by people like you. But he wasn't going to let her drag him into an argument. Instead, he flipped a page in his book as if her words were nothing more than background noise. Then, the tension thickened even further. A uniformed security guard stepped through the gate, scanning the scene with visible uncertainty. He looked young mid-20s, maybe, and didn't have the hardened, no-nonsense demeanor of a seasoned enforcer. Instead, he seemed hesitant, as if he already had a bad feeling about what was going on. The woman practically lit up when she saw him, waving him over like a queen summoning her knight. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, gesturing wildly at Ethan. "This man refuses to leave. He claims he lives here, but I know he doesn't. He wouldn't even show me his key fob." The guard turned to Ethan, his expression neutral, but watchful. Ethan sighed, closing his book with deliberate calm before standing. He towered over both the woman and the guard. "I do live here," Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. "Apartment 118. You can check with management if you need to." The pool deck felt like a stage, the entire audience waiting for what would happen next. The guard hesitated, glancing between Ethan and the woman. "Sir, do you have your key fob with you?" Ethan calmly reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He flipped it open, revealing not just his key fob, but also his driver's license, which clearly displayed the same address as the apartment complex. "Here you go," Ethan said, holding it up for the guard to inspect. The guard leaned in, checking the details, and then nodded, his expression shifting. "That checks out," he said, handing it back. "Sorry for the trouble, sir." The woman's face contorted in disbelief. "Wait, you're just going to take his word for it?" she demanded, her voice rising. The guard straightened his posture, his tone firmer now. "Ma'am," he provided the necessary proof. "There's nothing else to discuss." A quiet stir rippled through the crowd. People who had been silently watching began murmuring to one another. The young couple from earlier exchanged glances, then gave Ethan a small nod of approval. But before the moment could fully settle, a voice rang out from across the pool. "Enough is enough." All heads turned toward the unexpected interruption. Standing from a lounge chair was an older woman, late 60s, maybe, with silver hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed sun hat. She wore a flowy floral sundress, but despite her warm appearance, she carried herself with an undeniable air of authority. Her name was Miriam Walker, a longtime resident of Willow Ridge, and someone known for not tolerating nonsense. Miriam stepped forward, her eyes locked on the woman who had started all of this. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "But this isn't the first time this has happened, and I think it's about time someone spoke up." The woman accusing Ethan spun around, her defensiveness kicking in instantly. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice suddenly less certain. Miriam arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Oh, don't act innocent," she shot back. "You've been pulling this kind of thing for months, and frankly, we're all sick of it." She gestured around, as if inviting the other residents to confirm it. "Just last week, you harassed the mail carrier because he took a 5-minute break in his truck. And let's not forget when you called the cops on those college kids moving in because they looked suspicious." A few gasps whispered through the crowd. Someone let out a knowing sigh. Others exchanged side glances, clearly recalling the incidents. The woman's face reddened, her lips parting like she wanted to argue. But Miriam wasn't finished, and now this? Calling security on a man who's done absolutely nothing wrong, just because you don't recognize him. Miriam's voice cut through the air like a knife. "You're embarrassing yourself." The murmurs grew louder. Some people nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. The energy of the scene had completely flipped. The focus was no longer on Ethan, it was now squarely on the woman who had started it all. And for the first time, she didn't seem so sure of herself anymore. The security guard, clearly unsure of what to do, shifted uncomfortably, but made no move to intervene. Ethan, for his part, remained silent, letting Miriam take the lead. He could feel the tide turning, and for the first time that afternoon, he felt a small sense of relief. Someone else was standing up to this blatant injustice and people were listening. Miriam took a step closer to the woman, her voice calm but unwavering. "Do you even realize how ridiculous you look right now?" she asked, her words deliberate, cutting just enough to make an impact. "We're supposed to be a community. Treating people like they don't belong just because they don't fit your narrow idea of who belongs. That's not how we do things." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a single clap broke through the stillness. It started slow, then another, and another. The sound grew, rippling through the crowd like a wave. The woman's face paled, her confidence crumbling. The scene that she had so boldly orchestrated was now spiraling beyond her control. "This is absurd," she muttered, but there was no fight left in her voice. With a flustered huff, she gathered her things in a rush and marched out of the pool area, her head held high but her entire demeanor betraying her embarrassment. As she disappeared through the gate, Miriam turned back to Ethan, her expression gentler now. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said. "It's not right, and it's not fair." Ethan met her gaze, offering a small but sincere smile. "Thank you. I really appreciate that." Miriam gave him a reassuring nod before returning to her seat. Around them, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the energy in the air lingered. The incident wasn't over. Not yet. Someone had been recording the entire thing, and now the video was already making its way online. A younger resident, Lucas Monroe, a college student living in the complex, uploaded the footage to his social media with a simple caption: "This just happened at Willow Ridge. When will this stop?" The clip showed everything: the woman's accusations, Ethan's calm restraint, Miriam's impassioned stand, and the applause that followed. By the time the last few people left the pool area, the video was already beginning to spread. And soon, the world outside Willow Ridge would take notice. It didn't take long for the video to gain traction. Back in his apartment, Ethan sat on his couch, still processing the whirlwind of events from earlier. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing: texts, notifications, and tags from friends and co-workers who had seen the footage. Messages poured in, some expressing shock, others outrage, but most sending support. He hadn't anticipated how quickly things would spiral beyond the pool. In the leasing office, property manager Ms. Carter sat behind her desk, scrolling through the video on her phone. With each passing second, her expression darkened. This wasn't the first complaint about the woman in the video. Her name, Patricia Walsh, had come up before in reports from residents. But this time, there was undeniable proof. Ms. Carter exhaled, tapping her fingers on her desk. It was time to act. She picked up the phone and scheduled a meeting with both Patricia and Ethan for the following morning. Ethan, reluctant to relive the ordeal, agreed. He didn't just want closure for himself, he wanted accountability. For everyone who had ever been on the receiving end of this kind of behavior. The next morning, the atmosphere in the leasing office conference room was tense. Ethan sat on one side of the table, his expression calm but guarded. Patricia sat opposite him, but the confidence she'd displayed at the pool was gone. She avoided his gaze, her fingers tugging at the strap of her purse. Ms. Carter, seated between them, wasted no time. "I've reviewed the footage," she said, her voice measured but firm. "Patricia, this behavior is unacceptable." Patricia shifted in her seat, but Ms. Carter continued, "You have a pattern of targeting residents and visitors based on assumptions that have no merit. This is harassment, plain and simple." Patricia's face reddened. "I was just trying to keep the community safe." She sputtered. "How was I supposed to know he lived here?" Ms. Carter's gaze didn't waver. "It's not your job to police who belongs here. That's why we have security and a management team. Your actions have caused unnecessary distress to Mr. Carter and other residents. As of today, you are receiving an official warning. Any further complaints of this nature will result in the termination of your lease." Patricia opened her mouth, as if to argue, but quickly realized she was out of defenses. She sat there for a moment, flustered, humiliated. Finally, she muttered, "Fine." Then, without another word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out. Ms. Carter turned to Ethan, her expression softening. "I'm truly sorry this happened. If there's anything else we can do to support you, please let me know." Ethan nodded, exhaling slowly. "I appreciate that. Thank you." As he left the office, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just about him anymore. The video was still spreading, the conversation wasn't dying down, and something told him this story was far from over. As Ethan stepped out of the leasing office, a wave of emotions washed over him: relief, vindication, but also a quiet sadness that this had to happen in the first place. But the day's revelations weren't over. By that evening, the video had gone viral. News outlets picked it up, and hashtags like #EthanCarter and #CallOutKaren trended across social media. The internet erupted with conversations about accountability, bias, and the importance of standing up against injustice. Strangers reached out, sharing their own experiences and thanking him for how he handled the situation with dignity. What had started as a personal ordeal now carried a global weight, sparking debates and conversations that extended far beyond Willow Ridge. By the next morning, the video had amassed millions of views. It was everywhere on social media platforms, morning news programs, and even major talk shows, where commentators discussed the broader implications of bias and accountability. Ethan's name and face became the center of a national conversation, something he hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. He woke up to an inbox overflowing with messages. There were strangers thanking him for his composure, sharing how his actions inspired them to confront similar injustices in their own lives. Activists reached out, offering their platforms to amplify his voice. Even brands and organizations sent emails, asking if he'd be interested in collaborations or speaking engagements about his experience. But not all the responses were positive. Amid the flood of support, there were detractors, people accusing him of overreacting, of turning a simple misunderstanding into a spectacle. Ethan, though, didn't let the negativity faze him. He understood the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him, it was about a pervasive issue that needed addressing. And his story had struck a chord. Meanwhile, the fallout for Patricia Walsh was swift and public. An anonymous resident from Willow Ridge shared more accounts of her behavior, adding fuel to the fire. Her name trended alongside Ethan's, and while some sympathized with her public embarrassment, most condemned her actions. As the story continued to spread, one thing became clear: this wasn't just a moment. It was a movement, and the world was paying attention. As the video continued to spread like wildfire, the calls for accountability grew louder. Some suggested that Patricia Walsh attend anti-bias training, while others felt she should face legal repercussions for harassment. Meanwhile, back at Willow Ridge, the ripple effects of the incident were undeniable. Residents, who had once stayed silent about their own experiences, now began to speak up. Conversations about inclusion, respect, and unconscious bias took root, reshaping the community from within. Ms. Carter, recognizing the importance of the moment, took the feedback seriously. She organized workshops and panels on unconscious bias and community building, encouraging residents to engage in open discussions. A complex that had once felt fractured by unspoken tensions began to transform slowly, but surely, into a place of understanding and connection. For Ethan, the whirlwind of attention brought unexpected opportunities. He was invited to share his story on a national talk show, where he spoke candidly about the importance of staying calm in the face of injustice and the power of allyship. "It's not just about calling out bad behavior," Ethan said during the interview. "It's about creating spaces where everyone feels they belong, where no one has to prove they have a right to exist." The interview went viral, further solidifying Ethan as a symbol of resilience and grace under pressure. But for Ethan, the real impact was much closer to home. Neighbors he had barely spoken to before greeted him warmly in the hallways. Conversations that had once been non-existent now happened naturally. Genuine smiles, small talk, and kind words replacing the usual awkward nods. Miriam, the neighbor who had stood up for him, became a regular visitor to his apartment, often bringing over homemade cookies and sharing stories from her long life. What had begun as a tense, ugly confrontation had turned into something unexpectedly powerful, a catalyst for change, not just at Willow Ridge, but in the broader conversation about how people treat one another. Weeks after the poolside incident, life at Willow Ridge felt different. The tension that had once lingered between residents seemed to dissipate. People began to see one another differently, not as strangers to be judged, but as neighbors sharing the same space, each with their own stories and struggles. Ethan noticed the change every time he walked through the complex. Residents, who had once kept their distance, now waved or stopped for small conversations. Children played freely in the courtyard, their parents no longer watching anxiously from the sidelines. It felt as if the walls of suspicion and isolation had started to crumble, brick by brick. As for Patricia Walsh, her reputation within the complex had been tarnished. Though she hadn't been evicted, she kept a low profile, avoiding the common areas, walking quickly whenever she passed others, her once dominant presence now reduced to a whisper. Rumors swirled that she was considering moving, but nothing was confirmed. And while Ethan didn't wish her any harm, he hoped that, if nothing else, this experience had given her something to think about. Because at Willow Ridge, things had changed, and there was no going back. What was clear was that the incident had forced Patricia to confront her behavior. Whether or not she would truly change, that was a question only time could answer. Meanwhile, Ethan took the lessons he'd learned and turned them into action. With encouragement from Miriam and other supportive neighbors, he organized a community event, a barbecue open to all residents. The goal was simple: to foster connection and understanding among people who might otherwise never interact. The turnout was better than anyone expected. Families brought homemade dishes, kids ran around laughing, and conversations flowed effortlessly. Miriam sat in a corner, chatting with younger residents, her warm laughter ringing out over the sound of music and chatter. Ethan worked the grill, flipping burgers and handing out plates, feeling a sense of pride and fulfillment he hadn't expected. For the first time in a long time, Willow Ridge truly felt like a community. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the gathering, Ethan stepped back, looking over the crowd. It wasn't perfect, there was still work to be done, still barriers to break down, but it was a start. As the night wound down, residents lingered, reluctant to let the feeling of unity fade. Miriam approached Ethan, holding out a plate of cookies. "You've done something really special here," she said warmly. "I hope you know that." Ethan smiled, accepting the plate. "I couldn't have done it without you, Miriam. You were the first one to speak up." She waved him off with a laugh. "Well, somebody had to. But you turned it into something bigger, something meaningful." As the last guests drifted home, Ethan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The confrontation at the pool had started as a personal injustice, but it had become something more, a catalyst for change. And now, standing on the patio, watching his neighbors finally see each other for who they were, not as strangers, but as people sharing the same space, the same struggles, the same humanity he knew. This was just the beginning. What started as a moment of humiliation and frustration had transformed into an opportunity for growth and understanding, not just for Ethan, but for everyone involved. The viral video eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by the next trending story, but the lessons it carried remained. Ethan's composure, Miriam's courage, and the community's response had sparked a ripple effect, one that extended far beyond the gates of Willow Ridge. The story of Willow Ridge reminds us that standing up against prejudice isn't just about confrontation, it's about building bridges, creating dialogue, and fostering spaces where everyone feels safe and valued. Small actions can lead to big changes, but it all starts with the courage to say, "This isn't right." If this story moved you, let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts, your experiences, and your ideas for creating a more inclusive world. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together.